You on? Right, item number 10.3, seeking approval for public notification of proposed district plan change 2. Jason.
Tēnā koutou katoa, councillors, and a special tēnā koutou to Kirsten, who's with us today as well, and who's going to feature shortly in one of my acknowledgements as part of my very brief introduction. So this is quite the day for us in district planning. We're here to seek your approval to go ahead and publicly notify what is called in the planning world the intensification planning instrument, but what you'll be more familiar with as proposed plan change to the district plan. This is us helping council satisfy a statutory requirement on it to publicly notify this plan change no later than the 20th of August 2022, i.e. In a few weeks' time is the deadline for us to notify. I will hand over to Andrew shortly to walk you through the substance, but let me first start with making some acknowledgements. I do want to acknowledge our iwi partners. We have Kirsten here today, Denise also from Nahapu or Otaki. We have worked very closely with them throughout. Honor Octum Lewis from Te Runanga or Toa Rangatira for Ngāti Toa has been with us throughout, and also Claire Gibb for Atiawa ki Whakarongotai has been with us too, and we have been working with them all for a long time, and they have been very generous with their time, their patience with us, and while, as Andrew will explain further, there are some elements of proposed plan change 2 where due to the statutory nature of this plan change we have struggled to find a way. There are also elements in this plan change that we are very, very proud of as staff, and I think as council you can be too, where we have found a way, and some nation leading, in my view, provisions for papakainga in this plan change, which we are very, very proud of, and which Andrew and I have certainly learnt a lot along the way through working with our iwi partners. So thank you very much. I do want to thank Andrew personally as well, sitting next to me here. Andrew Banks from Boffa has been fantastic, and I could go on for half an hour installing his virtues. Just suffice to say, he's damn good.
Only half an hour.
Okay, I'll stop there. I'd like to thank too staff in the team. Abby Morris has been so good at helping coordinate and get stuff done that I would struggle to do. Matt Musprat, former staff member, and has continued to provide sterling advice throughout, and a range of other consultants and staff members in my team as well. So I'll just touch briefly before I hand over to Andrew on a couple of things. One is just some of the waypoints that we've crossed to get here, and then also touching very briefly on the key steps after today. So we've been endeavouring to engage with the community on how to grow as a council now for quite some time. The growth strategy is the precursor to this plan change, a number of other policies as well, but it was the growth strategy where we first as a council engaged with the community about intensification, about the need to accommodate central government direction, which was driving us to look at the district in a different way and look at centres and around centres and around our railway stations, and really look at having to provide for more intensification around those. The growth strategy consultation was something that we worked hand in glove with the team leading that, and we are very confident that proposed plan change 2 is wholly consistent with the growth strategy and gives complete effect to it, acknowledging that the growth strategy has a number of elements to it that are beyond the scope of what this plan change is allowed to cover in law. There has been also engagement on a full draft, an exposure draft of this plan change, public engagement, going much further than the Resource Management Act requires, but making sure that the community has as much notice in advance of the details of this plan change. And over 200 pieces of feedback were received in response to the consultation that we did back in April and May. So we do feel as though Council can be confident that we have done as well as anybody, given the challenging circumstances that central government has put on Council in terms of timeframes. We think we have done as much community consultation as could feasibly be done, and we've really endeavoured to consider all feedback received, and proposed plan change 2 is all the better for it, particularly the feedback that we've received from our iwi partners, but also the feedback we've received from the general public and a range of stakeholders. I'll just touch briefly on the key steps after today. So today is about making a decision to set and train the statutory part of the process for proposed plan change 2. There will be the opportunity for public to make submissions on proposed plan change 2. Between now and notification, there is a lot of work for the team to do. We are looking at an indicative date of the 11th of August for public notification, and in between now and then we are looking to email all of the people who gave us feedback on the draft to point them in the direction of where they can see the response to their feedback. That is a part of the Section 32 package, the very comprehensive package that it is, and that it needs to be, given the significance of this plan change. We will be preparing a range of materials for notification, including, as noted in the council paper, directly mailing all 25,000 plus ratepayers of the district to let them know of the opportunity to make a submission on proposed plan change 2. We will also be doing things like making sure our website is completely up to date and is a good landing place for all of the materials for people to access to make a submission. One of the recommendations for Council to consider today is how long that submission period should be. You'll note that the recommendation is that it should be 20 working days. There's reasons for that given in the report. We are working to a challenging statutory deadline set by the Minister to complete this process. And we have also reflected again on how much engagement there has been already. However, the 20 working day period is a decision for Council to make about whether that should be any longer than that. That is the minimum. Following the closure of submissions, there will be an opportunity for people to make further submissions, and then there will be an independent hearings panel that will consider submissions. People will have the opportunity, if they so wish, to be heard in front of that panel in support of their submission. That panel will then retire and make their recommendations back to Council, and as I mentioned, the Minister has set that challenging deadline of 20th of August 2023 for Council to make its decision on submissions, i.e. whether or not to accept or reject the recommendations from the independent hearings panel. 12 months for a plan change of this significance, with the number of submissions that we may receive and the range of issues that it presents, is a challenging time frame, but that is the time frame that we are working to. So with all of that in mind, I'm going to hand over to Andrew now to give you a bit of a verbal run through of the substance of the material, and then of course over to you, Mr. Mayor. Andrew.
Thanks, Jason. In December 2021, the government amended the Resource Management Act to require that all Tier 1 district councils, including Kapiti, change their district plans to enable more development to occur within their urban areas. While proposed Plan Change 2 is driven by a statutory requirement that council notify an intensification planning instrument, it is important to recognise that housing is a key resource management issue for the district. The council's housing and business development capacity assessment identifies that more than 16,000 dwellings need to be constructed over the next 30 years to provide for population growth. However, under the current district plan settings, there would be a shortfall of approximately 8,400 dwellings over that same period. The need to provide for housing is reflected in a range of council plans and strategies, including Te Tupu Pai, the district growth strategy, the long-term plan, and the council's housing strategy. And Plan Change 2 is a key aspect of implementing these plans and strategies. Housing is also a particular issue for tangata whenua who have identified that the current district plan does not meet their aspirations for to live as Māori on their ancestral land. So while Plan Change 2 is required by statute, it also addresses the real housing needs of the current and future Kapiti community. The scope of Plan Change 2 is defined by Section 80E of the Resource Management Act. This and the associated sections of the Act set legislative requirements and restrictions for what can and cannot be included in the plan change. Firstly, Plan Change 2 incorporates the government's medium density residential standards, or NDRS, into the district plan. These standards provide for the construction of up to three-storey residential units on sites in the general residential zone as a permitted activity. As part of incorporating the NDRS into the district plan, Plan Change 2 proposes to rezone a number of sites within or adjacent to the district's existing urban areas as general residential zone to further assist the supply of housing. Plan Change 2 also gives effect to Policy 3 of the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, or NPSUD, by enabling increased building heights within and around the district's metropolitan, town and local centres, as well as within a walkable catchment of the train stations served by the Kapiti Line commuter rail service. Plan Change 2 also provides for 3 new qualifying matters. Qualifying matters are areas where the district plan can provide for less development than otherwise required by the NDRS, or Policy 3 of the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, subject to certain requirements in the RMA being met. Plan Change 2 provides for a coastal qualifying matter precinct. This precinct maintains the status quo level of development in the part of the district that has been identified as being potentially susceptible to coastal erosion hazard. This precinct is intended as an interim measure until the management of coastal hazards is addressed through a future coastal environment plan change. Plan Change 2 also adds Kairewere Urupa at Waikanai Beach to the district plan schedule of Waihi Tapu sites as a qualifying matter. This recognises the significance of the area as a Waihi Tapu to tangata whenua, including Te Atiawa ki Whakarongotai, and restricts further development that would otherwise be enabled by Plan Change 2. The significance of the area is detailed in a Waitangi Tribunal report on the matter, which is appended to the Section 32 report. Plan Change 2 also provides for a marae takiwā precinct as a qualifying matter. This precinct recognises that marae and the tikanga and kawa associated with them are sensitive to the impacts of surrounding intensification by restricting intensification on the sites adjacent to Raukawa marae in Otaki and Whakarongotai marae in Waikanai. In addition to enabling intensification, the RMA also provides for Plan Change 2 to include provisions that enable the development of papakainga. Papakainga are defined as housing and ancillary activities, including social, cultural, educational, recreational and commercial activities for tangata whenua on their ancestral land. Plan Change 2 proposes to add a papakainga chapter to the district plan, which includes objectives, policies, that provide for the development of Papakainga and embed provisions within the general residential, town centre and rural zones that allow Papakainga development anywhere in these zones where tangata whenua own ancestral land. The Papakainga provisions are the result of extensive work undertaken with tangata whenua through Ngāti Toa Rangatira, Ngā Hapu Otaki and Te Atiawa ki Whakarongotai. As a result, they are, in our view, a unique reflection of the aspirations of the tangata whenua of this district. Finally, the RMA also authorises Plan Change 2 to make amendments to financial contributions provisions to improve their efficiency and effectiveness. The proposed amendments to financial contributions provisions clarify the matters that can be considered when taking financial contributions for the purposes of infrastructure development, and clarifies that financial contributions can be taken for offsetting adverse effects. Plan Change 2 is likely to have a range of impacts on the district's urban environments. Firstly, the plan change will lead to a significant increase in the number of dwellings that are enabled by the district plan in urban areas. While only a proportion of these dwellings can be expected to be feasible and realised over a 30-year period, it is likely to contribute significantly to addressing the shortfall in development capacity identified in the Council's Housing and Business Development Capacity Assessment. In addition to this, Plan Change 2 will lead to a more efficient use of urban land for development, potentially reducing the need to enable more development in greenfield areas. Over time, however, the level of development enabled by Plan Change 2 is likely to lead to a change in character in the district's urban areas as they transition over time to accommodate increased density. This change in character is consistent with the objectives of the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, which provides that New Zealand's urban environments, including their amenity values, develop and change over time in response to the diverse and changing needs of people, communities, and future generations. In order to encourage new development to contribute positively to this change in character, Plan Change 2 includes design guides for higher density residential and mixed-use development. These guides are applied through resource consents for development that breaches density standards. Development enabled by PC2 is also likely to increase the demand for infrastructure over time. In general, these impacts will need to be addressed through Council's role in collecting development and financial contributions from new development to support the funding of new and upgraded infrastructure, and through Council's role in planning for infrastructure to meet the needs of population growth through the long-term plan. The development of Plan Change 2 is a continuation of the conversations held with the community and tangata whenua initiated through the long-term plan and Te Tupu Pai. Following on from the development and adoption of Te Tupu Pai, a full draft version of Plan Change 2 was prepared and put out to the community in April for feedback. Over 200 submissions were received on that draft. All feedback was was given consideration as part of the development of the plan change, and in several instances the plan change was amended in response to that feedback. An attachment 4 to the Council report outlines the consideration given to each submission received. The development of Plan Change 2 also involved several hui and wānanga with tangata whenua throughout the year. The involvement of tangata whenua enabled the development of the Papakainga provisions. It also highlighted a range of matters of concern raised by iwi in relation to the intensification of urban areas and the impacts of growth more broadly. We have been able to address some of these matters as qualifying matters through this plan change. However, due to the statutory limitations of the plan change, it is recognised that ongoing work beyond Plan Change 2 is required to address some of these concerns. Opportunities for this include work associated with implementing the National Policy Statement for freshwater management, infrastructure capacity assessment, and future mana whenua plan change. So, after approval to notify, the plan change enters the formal consultation and decision-making process described in the RMA. In this case, the RMA requires Plan Change 2 to use the intensification streamlined planning process. So after notification of the plan change, the plan will follow several prescribed steps. This includes the opportunity for the public to make submissions on the plan change. The plan change, including the submissions made on it, will be considered by an independent hearings panel who will hold a hearing and make recommendations back to the Council on the plan change. the Council must make a decision on the recommendations of the panel by the 20th of August 2023. At that stage, the Council can choose to accept the recommendations of the panel, in which case the plan change becomes operative. If the Council chooses to reject some or all of the recommendations of the panel, then those recommendations are referred to the Minister for the Environment, who makes the final decision. As prescribed in the RMA, there is no right to appeal the Council's decision on Plan Change 2 to the Environment Court. So, in summary, Plan Change 2 represents a significant change to the district plan to improve the supply and variety of housing for the Kapiti community and enable the development of papakainga for tangata whenua. While Plan Change 2 has been prepared in accordance with the statutory scope outlined in the RMA, it has also been prepared in a manner that implements Te Tupu Pai and takes into account feedback received from tangata whenua and the community. So it's on this basis that we make the recommendations to you, as outlined in the Council report, and seeking approval to publicly notify the plan change. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much for that, Andrew. Can I kick it off by asking Jason, given you've said that we are facing challenging statutory deadlines, and the whole country, councils around the whole country will be under pressure, they'll be chasing and nail down resources, human resources, in terms of hearing commissioners. Have we already got ours nailed, contracted, signed off, or we're going to end up with second, third best?
We're in discussions, Mr. Mayor. Nothing's locked down yet, but we certainly have some very exciting candidates that we're in discussions with.
Good to know. Right, open for questions. Councillor Compton.
Thank you. Through the Mayor, a few questions from me. So, as you know, we've sort of liaised about on the question of local character policies in this, and your answers have been, I guess, extremely helpful in understanding, I guess, the implementation of those and how they relate to the MDRS in particular. One thing that sort of popped to mind is we've put in, I think it was one of the variations we did that dictated things around, say, the permeability of fences and fence heights and stuff in Waikanae Beach and that. Does that sort of thing still follow through in this situation, or do some of those, I guess, design aspects get replaced by the design guide that's part of this plan change?
So in terms of the broader Waikanae Beach character precinct, and just like any of the other character precincts, the rules that currently limit density in those areas are proposed to be removed by Plan Change 2 because they're inconsistent with the MDRS and the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. You actually mentioned the fence rule, which just applies to Waikanae Beach. We're not amending that rule because it actually isn't a density rule. It doesn't limit density. It's just about how much space there is between the fences. So that particular rule actually does stay. But apart from that, the rules that limit density are removed and replaced, as with the rest of the urban environment, with the medium density residential standards or the greater levels of intensification required by the National Policy Statement on Urban Development.
Cool, thank you for that. Now, I guess in thinking about those, and in your email response yesterday, you sort of suggested that, in theory, if someone went and built 3 dwellings on a lot that complied with MDRS intensity standards, then they went to apply for a resource consent to subdivide it, essentially because they've already changed the built environment in that area, then the consideration they have to give is fairly minimal, and we can't decline the resource consent application because it is a controlled activity. I guess what scope is there for people to go and then judicially review that sort of thing? Because I know there's obviously quite a high profile situation in Auckland and Glendowie that's just come to the media this morning, where people went and judicially reviewed a proposal for townhouses to go in somewhere. Now, admittedly, that's under the old rules, but I guess what's the risk of similar silly shenanigans like that going on? Well, not, I shouldn't say shenanigans, because it is their legal right to go and do that. But it sort of illustrates, I guess, the point the government's trying to get to removing that ability for people to object on what they saw as spurious grounds for this sort of thing. So what sort of, I guess, risk is there in terms of that, where we're sort of saying, look, it's only a fairly minor consideration, you could deal with it with a single sentence in a report in terms of if you're talking about historical subdivisions. What sort of risk, I suppose, comes out of that? Is it fairly ironclad in terms of our ability to defend it, or is it the legal answer, it depends?
One of the joys of our business is that there's very rarely the ability for us to say absolute answers to things. We can only hypothesise. One of the joys. And we talk a lot about, I guess, things like risk and likelihood, because that's the nature of our business. I guess one observation I might make, Andrew, and you may have some others of your own, is that Plan Change 2 is going to quite significantly change likelihoods and change risks to the point where one might suggest that the advice that a lawyer might give to somebody who approached them going, should I do this? Should I mount a judicial review in this circumstance? One can only hypothesise that that lawyer might respond and say, well, the odds of success are going to be that much lower because of Plan Change 2. But Andrew, you may have something that's a little bit less waffly than me to say about that.
I was just going to refer actually back to the example you've given, and that's very much about constructing 3 dwellings as a permitted activity, and then coming along later to undertake a subdivision as a controlled activity and applying for a resource consent to do so. So that being the example. With respect to judicial review, that is in the realm of the lawyers, but in a lot of cases, judicial review happens around the decision whether or not to notify neighbours of a consent application. And in the case of that, the rule for subdivision, which we have to put in because it's one of the MDRS rules, public and limited notification must be precluded. So the council can't notify a neighbour in that instance, and that's clear in not just the rule but also in the Act itself. So I would suggest that the risk, any risk, is very residual, like very marginal at all, because the council can't notify that application. So
cool. No, that is very helpful and very reassuring. I think isn't so far that you can be reassuring around these things. My next question was, I know there's been a lot of discussion about the Waikanai Garden Precinct, because I know I instigated a lot of it in our previous discussions about this, but I know there's some more recently around, I guess, the vegetation cover and that sort of thing. Now, presumably some of it's covered by, notified trees and whatnot.
Notable trees.
What about the significant natural native areas, that sort of policy direction in terms of, would that be able to cover some of those areas in terms of protection, or are they sort of too small in their scale in terms of what that regulatory framework's aiming at?
Well, in the current Waikanai Garden Precinct, there are, in addition to the individually protected trees, there are already in the district plan some small areas of what are called ecological sites, which are groups of trees, and they will also continue to be protected as a qualifying matter. So, does that address?
Sort of. I guess because obviously SNAs have been a pretty contentious issue around the country, but we've obviously got to go down that track of figuring that out. So I guess would some of those areas be able to qualify for that, or are they too small in scale in terms? Because I know a lot of it was aimed at those sort of natural areas on rural land in particular, where a lot of the angst of it has come from. But I guess the question is, there's some quite still big lots in Waikanai that do have, I'm thinking of 1 or 2 in particular, where they have sort of maybe a couple of buildings on them, but literally the rest of it is still quite extensive vegetation. So would that be the sort of thing that could be covered under SNAs, or?
So we are, I guess, in our district, relative to some other districts, quite lucky that well, it's not luck, it's hard work, that has led to SNAs already being in our district plan. And there was a process proceeded before our time here, which would have involved a lot of consideration of all potential candidates, and with applying some criteria at the time that were considered appropriate, to determine which ones met the grade to be included in the district plan as ecological sites. We do have to wait for the final form of the National Policy Statement for Indigenous Biodiversity before we can really say, have we got any other sites in the district that could be potential candidates? I mean, that's been our feedback to Greater Wellington as to why perhaps for their RPS changes they should wait and see what the final form of that should be before they try and guess what the RPS should do to align with it. So I guess I'm offering a slightly similar advice to that here, is a bit of let's wait and see.
No, that is extremely helpful. I'd just like to indicate to the Mayor that I'd be very happy to move the recommendations when we come to that point.
Councillor Coates. Councillor Coates.
Thank you, Your Worship, the Mayor, and welcome to the meeting. My first question is possibly to the Chief Executive, Acting Chief Executive. And look, as someone who likes to do my job well, it's really a question around process, and I appreciate we've been under a lot of pressure, the organisation has. The appendices with the paper that we've received today is 1,876 pages, and the report itself is 113, and that's excluding the public excluded paper and associated paperwork. Is the expectation that councillors are not required to read all this information within the 5 days we've received it? Because you're looking at 400 pages a day, and I'm in fear of making a decision here when I don't feel I've adequately read all the information given the volume of it. Is it just accepted that it's a procedural thing and we weren't required to, or should we have had more time to be able to give it more due diligence?
There's a question there's a question to the Minister.
Possibly.
Well, I think Councillor Coates, really the answer to that is very much in the hands of each councillor. On the face of it, it is an unreasonable amount of information. The timelines are tighter than would be desired, but you reflect on the sheer volume of work that's been necessary to get to here. And we got the information to you because we feel we had to. I doubt in other similar circumstances people would read cover to cover all of those things, and I'm not sure that you could be criticised for it.
Thank you, Gary. And I guess part of the question was, and I don't know, it's not a criticism of staff, but was it possible for us to have received some of that information earlier so we could have, fully fulfilled our role?
I suspect Jason's better placed to answer that than me, because most of what you're talking about would have occurred prior to my coming on board.
Councillor, I have sympathy for what you're saying. We appreciate the volume of work involved in reading council agendas. What we've tried to do with this package is provide a package that submitters can also find evidence that talks to the issues that they're concerned about. So you'll see in the attachments technical work covering things like the special character areas and updating those assessments, because we know that there are, through feedback both on the growth strategy and the draft plan change, that there are people who have concerns about impacts on those special character areas. So we commissioned some work, and it's there for all to digest and to use as they see fit to inform their submissions. There are some other attachments which are intended to make it easier to understand the package. So there are some summaries of what the provisions are, for example, there are, of course, the need to have attachments that are actually the provisions, including the maps that go with that, the changes to the district plan maps. And the 32 report itself as an attachment is by necessity of needing to meet section 32 itself lengthy. It is because this is a significant plan change. You'll recall in recent times we've had omnibus plan changes that don't have the same degree of significance, but even, I was reflecting just before this meeting, a plan change that has changes one number in one rule still needs a plan change, a section 32 report of about 20 to 25 pages. That is the law that we are operating under, and we need to be very sure when we're giving you a package of information that we are able to stand up and say that we have done everything we need to do under the Act, that when you make your decision you are not exposed in any way. So while I do apologise for the amount of reading that you have to do, I also don't apologise for the amount of reading, unfortunately, that you have to do, because that is what the law requires us to generate.
Thank you, Jason. And if I could qualify, I'm not complaining about the amount of reading, it's the time frame in which we've had to read it. It's 397 pages per day consistently over 5 days. But thank you for the response. I have a couple of follow-up questions. Sorry, not follow-up, but additional questions. And look, if I could be really clear, I know that Jason, you and team have worked hard on this. It's not a criticism of the work that you've done. Point number 50 on page 71 refers to the key matters raised by Ngā Hapu o Ōtaki. I also acknowledge that this is an incredibly technical area in terms of PC2 and the surrounding matters with it. One of the issues that was raised through via Ngā Hapu o Ōtaki was around the building heights around town centres, and I don't see that reflected in the feedback. And was that deliberate, or is that because it's not relevant to PC2? I note it's referenced further down at another bullet point which I've got, where it talks about the heights. So yeah, I'm interested in that, and then I've got a follow-up question.
I can answer that question, councillor. So all the feedback that we received from Ngā Hapu o Ōtaki was relevant, and we considered it all, and including this piece of feedback. And what I mentioned earlier was that we have been constrained by the law about this particular plan change on what we can do to respond to all that feedback. So we have been able to, as a qualifying matter, reduce heights and densities in the part of the town centre zone at Ōtaki, which is next to Raukawa Marae. We weren't able to do that across the entire Ōtaki urban area because we couldn't establish a qualifying matter across the entire urban area. So that's the kind of constraints that I was talking about us having to deal with through this plan change.
Thank you for the response, but again, I'm just concerned that Ngā Hapu's feedback, are you saying that couldn't be reflected in there because it's not relevant? I see under page 66, 25.2.3, building heights of 21 metres 6 stories within town centre zone at Ōtaki Railway and so forth. I don't see that in the feedback that Ngā Hapu raised concerns around the impacts of building heights around, it wasn't just Marae, it was around the town centres as well.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, is I'm saying that's correct, that those concerns were raised, but we could only, within the statutory constraints that we had, we could only address those around the marae. Does that make sense?
And look, I'm not trying to argue with you.
Hold on. Can I just add to the fact that I think the report in 53.3 does mention future work, Manawhenua district plan change. I assume that this is one of the areas that you'd be exploring.
Well, I guess the point that I'm making under number 50, key matters raised by Ngā Hapu o Ōtaki. I understood that was a key matter raised by them, and it's not included in the report. I'm happy to be proven wrong. I just don't see it there, that it was raised as a matter by them.
I guess it comes down to how you interpret 50.1, Councillor. You're specifically talking about height. When we are saying concern that imminent intensification in the Otaki area will have more negative impacts on the people of Ngā Hapu Otaki and the Taio than positive, we were meaning that, I believe, to include concerns about height.
Thank you, Jason. Look, my last one, and please bear with me, I'm not trying to be difficult or stir, and I don't want to upset Councillor Compton. Given the recent decision by Auckland City Council, which I guess to be blunt, is some would argue is in conflict with the MPSUD around the decision that they've made and kind of kicked it to the independent panel. What is stopping council restricting building heights within that town centre other than just around the marae? Because from what I've seen, and again I'm happy to be corrected, is that Auckland Council have taken the views of their community on board and left it to the panel and then ultimately the minister to make a determination on. Am I right in that, or have I misread that situation? I guess the question there is that something that council could do, and if so, is now the time? I appreciate it's a contentious issue, but we're only talking about the Otaki Town Centre. I know we'd be interested in the thoughts from Kirsten if she is willing, but I acknowledge she may have not had time to consider it.
Is that a question to us or to...
Sorry.
The question is to you.
Is it to me?
Yep.
Sorry, Jason. The question is it possible for council with PC2 to raise, to reduce the building heights around the Otaki Town Centre as opposed to just around the marae? Now, I remember from the briefing, we talked about qualifying matters and we needed to have evidence. And I guess I'm pointing back to the recent decision from Auckland City Council. I wouldn't be raising this if it wasn't for what Auckland City Council have done by showing that they haven't necessarily directly conformed with the advice.
Sure. So there's a number of answers I'll probably need to give to that, Councillor. First of all, we have prepared proposed plan change 2, informed by legal advice about the appropriate approach to take to qualifying matters, to interpretation of the law generally, because of course the law has been changed recently. There's no case law. We really did need to rely on assistance, legal advice to understand what the right approach was to particular challenges. So I am confident that what we have in front of you is as robust as it can be. I have no criticism to make for our fellow councils who may have decided to take other approaches. I can only speak to what we have put in front of you and the confidence I have in how robust it is and how consistent with that legal advice. The MPSUD policy 3D is key, and it constrains discretion considerably about the heights that you can have in a town centre or a local centre or a metropolitan centre. It is very directive. There is not much room to move, and we are comfortable that what we have in Plan Change 2 is consistent with policy 3D. Now there are submissions, or at least feedback on the draft, suggesting in fact that the heights could have been greater, the walkable distance could have been further. So there is feedback, and there will be submissions, and such is the process, and so should it be, that people will be able to make those submissions to the independent hearings panel, who are qualified to consider those matters and come up with a final recommendation to council. But the qualifying matter tool, again, legally informed, is a tool which is predominantly aimed at site-specific evidence needed when it comes to consideration of things like character. And it's a very high bar to reach. So for anybody, that people are welcome to make submissions expressing a view which is alternative to the view that's in proposed Plan Change 2. They're going to need to support that with with evidence, and the independent hearings panel will be the ultimate determinant of, I guess, or council will ultimately be the determinant of whether this is the only way to go. But we are, again, confident that what you have in front of you, we have thought very long and hard, and I hope our iwi partners realise that there is nothing lightly arrived at when we say that the national direction on this has pinned us into a corner. I hope that by the work that Andrew has led in particular on coming up with creative solutions to things like the marae, intensification around marae, the open-mindedness which we have endeavoured to show with the Papakainga provisions, which were well outside the comfort zone of where council planners traditionally live, that when I say that we have open-mindedly considered this issue, I hope that that is heard for what it is.
Thank you, Jason, and I'll keep this brief. I'm assuming Ngā Hapu can submit through the submission process that they believe that that area around the marae should be extended, and then that would be considered appropriately by the independent hearing panel?
Yes.
Thank you.
Can I just add, from my reading, I know that Ngā Hapu have said they understand council's staff hands are tied in terms of the legislative framework, and they had signaled that they wish to take the matter up with the relevant ministers. Having said that, I think it will be remiss of me not to refer this to our EV representative from that. Kirsten, if you wish to add anything. No, you pull it or you press it down.
It's red.
Oh, thank you for the opportunity to talk to this. Yeah, I do have a few things to say, more so comments than questions. I might just jump first, though, to the matters that James has raised. Yeah, it is a concern for us, what's going to happen to the Otaki Township and then the homes in that catchment, the 400-metre walkable area around that. We've focused on the local Otaki Township, but some of these things are also relevant for the township at the main road. Actually, I'm going to go back and talk about some other things soon, so this might make better sense after I do that. One of the things is that, Otaki is right on the edge of Kapiti, and so we're caught up in this Tier 1 situation, so all these things are applying to us. We also acknowledge that Otaki is identified as a growth area, and we've all seen that that's been happening. But the growth that's going to be enabled is far more than will be required for these population estimates. And if it happens, particularly in that local town area, because the street between the buildings is quite narrow, if we get buildings that even 3 or 4 story buildings, let alone 6 or higher, it's going to create a quite an unattractive area, as well as the houses around that. So we have a lot of local whānau that live close to the marae, and there's potential to create an area where people may not want to live. The 3 times 3 story homes on a section right next to a 1 story home is a reality. The rules enable that, and so we can have just this haphazard stuff going on. And actually in that area it's 4 story buildings, so it's even more concerning. So we know that the policy 3D and the NPSUD has a number of constraints that's really clearly worded in the legislation. But we also know that the legislation is inconsistent with the policy behind it in some ways, and that's included in the letter that we've provided. The copy of the letter we've sent to the Minister that we've also provided to the Council. So that policy is fundamental. The legislation should be, expressing or creating the rules to express the policy and the desires of the people. And so that gives really strong grounds for us to be able to question how we've ended up with these sort of really, strict constraints around what we can do. And yeah, we've said that we're going to talk to the government about it. We sent them a letter to a number of ministers, and none of them have replied yet. So we need to expand what we're doing there. But there's also a question around the council and the council's appetite to do something about that and respond to the government. Just because some legislation has been created, it hasn't always been the case that councils will just comply, especially when there's concern, from a number of areas, and this questionable sort of thing about the way the legislation has been written. We haven't asked you to take any steps in that respect, and have pointed out a number of things and left it to you to consider what you might want to do. So I'll just step back a minute. I'm not going to sort of read through everything that we submitted. I know that you've read that earlier, and we've talked to you about it at a number of times. But I do want to acknowledge all of the staff that we've worked with on this, especially Jason, and also Andrew, for the way that they've worked with us. We've had a very high level of engagement, really good, robust discussions, and excellent questions. And it's been a really open way of thinking and talking and working through a range of, for Andrew and Jason in particular, new concepts and ideas, but also for us, because particularly me, because I'm didn't know too much about planning before that. Our Ngāti Toa and Te Atiawa colleagues and the others from Ngā Hapu Ōtaki that were engaged with us knew a bit more. So they were really critical to the progress we made with the papakainga provisions. So e mihi ana ki a koutou. We're really proud of those papakainga provisions. I'm sure I've told you that maybe 3 times already. They do have the potential to make transformative change for some of our whānau, hapu and iwi. We do note though that it will take years to see anything stood up on those places. And then of course we don't all have land interests or interests in land to enable us to do those. So the broader picture is still very important to us. And yeah, I'd have to support the comments around the volume of material in the papers. It's hefty and also dense, and yeah, I've struggled to get through it. I haven't gotten through all of it yet. So, in saying that, we're not opposed to intensification in principle. We need more homes, and there are other benefits that come to with some of this growth. Our concern is around the way that it's being done, and so, like you, our aspiration is Te Tupu Pai, growing well, respecting our whenua and why, and placing people at the heart. So we're wanting to embrace a way of communities living well with our environment, not at its expense, because any damage to the environment will be detrimental to all of us. And then again, then there's the point that the intensification that's going to be permitted is at least 5 times more than the projected needs, and I don't know how much more it is than the projected needs just in Otaki. The background work around the impact on our taiao hasn't been done. We fully expect that more damage to the environment will occur in the way that this is happening. There's the very real risk of high buildings popping up in the middle of suburban areas and really haphazard growth. So we're about building communities and relationships with our taiao people and creating a space where neighbours and developers are talking to each other because with these sort of changes they won't necessarily do that, and we've seen around the country that it's not happening. There are large developments going up and neighbours aren't being informed at all. A couple of other things to note, just that, for Otaki it's not a rapid transit stop now, and it's not actually in the plans at the moment either, so no idea when that's going to happen. And then the marginalisation, the impact on our whānau. Our experience has been that more homes in a town doesn't mean more homes for our whānau. In fact, it's resulted in whānau needing to move out of the area and away from their marae and all of their whānau and important cultural connections. Then we've got something else that's pretty special in Otaki that we're mindful that we need to do more so it will continue to grow, and we think we need some time in order to work through this, and that's our education precinct area. We've got Otaki's one of the few places in the country where you have a number of kohanga in a quite a small geographical area, a kura kaupapa Māori, a kura iwi, and then a school that has an immersion unit, and then a wānanga. So you have the kohanga to wānanga education pathway, and you also have quite a high number of Māori in the township closely connected to the marae. Well, that's the other thing, a number of marae in a small geographical area. So we have a good number of people who've been through the education pathway and have a good understanding of te ao Māori, practice tikanga, speak te reo Māori, and a whole range of other things, who are engaged with their hapu and iwi, and you see te ao Māori making progress, getting a couple of steps back towards where we were 150 years ago or so, before massive change occurred. And it's something really special, and it's acknowledged as something special nationally. And so, yeah, I know it's not about housing density and intensification, but it has the potential to, those things occurring have the potential to impact on it. So it's something, because it's something so unique and special to us, we give it a lot of consideration and want to make sure we have some time to understand how that might impact on it, and make sure we're planning and working towards things so that any impact is mitigated. We acknowledge the Marae Takiwa precinct goes some way to addressing one of our concerns, and as has been pointed out, the team advised that there is not a mechanism to do more about it. We think there are other ways to do something about it and to challenge it, but didn't really see it as our task to point out how that might be done, or to ask you to do that. So we're taking those steps. I do acknowledge there was suggestions maybe 6 months ago of the council supporting us in those steps that we're wanting to take, so we'd welcome some support and some discussion on how we might be able to do that. So we are preparing another submission to KCDC and to a letter to central government, and we'll be expanding a bit more on what we did earlier. Also intend to share it with our some of the other organisations in our township. And so just to reiterate what's in our submission and our letter to the government is that what we're asking for is to slow things down a bit, just scale things back for Otaki by reducing the building heights in the town areas and also in the urban areas. So we're not suggesting that we don't have any of these things happen, but to just reduce the building heights for now so we can get some of the other important background work done. I think those are the main points. If I've left anything out, James, please let me know if I didn't respond to any of your questions. Thank you.
Right, that's your debate session there, done and dusted, I suppose. Councillor Pravnov.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So just to clarify, are we still in question time?
Yes, we are in question time. That was the treaty extension.
Okay, thank you. So I have two questions. One was actually just following up on Councillor Coote's comments about I suppose, the length of time that we had to I suppose, read and on top of that actually understand the documents before us. And I suppose in a situation like this, what I often do is I basically like to search on the document. This document could not be searched, which makes it even more difficult. I had to, and just by comparison, the document that's on the KCDC site was broken into a whole lot of separate documents, and that was searchable. So it's obviously possible. So I suppose, and I know that this is not the first time this has happened. So I'm just asking, is there any particular reason why it wasn't a searchable document, please?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I think that's probably a question for Democracy Services rather than for us.
It's either COVID or a technical glitch in the system.
It's a matter of software, and also we had to break it up into the separate cover due to the size of it. Otherwise, it was
I think you sent an email in that direction, didn't you? Yep. So
so the big document of 1,800 words, that was all one document, which couldn't be searched, whereas all the individual ones could be. So they're all PDFs, but maybe it's just, maybe not potentially understanding the way that they're actually saved to the hub, and I don't know whether it's the hub that has some restrictions, but and I think this has come up before, but it would be really useful if appendices, attachments could all be searchable, because it just makes our life so much easier.
If you would like to follow that offline with Democratic Services, it will be useful. You got any other questions?
I have, thank you. Yeah. So I think very early on in your presentation, Jason, you made the comment, and just correct me if I got this wrong, is that once this decision was made, that was final, it couldn't be appealed through any court process. Could you please clarify that?
That is correct.
I actually thought that if you actually submitted to the process, if you made a submission that's going to be going to then be heard by a panel, that you were in a position of being able to appeal it.
So this is one of the curiosities of this particular plan change, councillor. There is bespoke legislation which both determines what you're allowed to include in it, what you may include in it, and therefore by default anything else you can't include in it. There's also direction about what the process needs to be, and the process needs to not provide for appeals, merit appeals to the Environment Court or any appeals as far as I'm aware.
Okay, thank you. Those are my two questions. Thank you.
Councillor Holliday.
Three, Mr. Chair. Yeah, like I've just got a real quick one. It really just revolves around point 25 on page 66, and it's just the town centre zones versus the local centre zones. I've been pretty concerned about the Paraparaumu and Raumati beach areas being designated as a town centre zone and allowing up to 6 stories. And a reason I'm concerned about that is just its proximity to the beach area, climate, and just ground stability in that area for those sorts of things. Now, I appreciate fundamentally that could be sorted out through consenting processes, whether you can actually build up 6 stories. But what was the definition used with regards to the difference between a town centre zone or being classified as a local centre zone, which would have had, say, a 4-storey height maximum?
Thank you, Councillor. So the district plan before all of this came to pass actually has got a hierarchy determined in it. Now that got updated by National Planning Standards amendments, which occurred by was it 30th of June last year. We updated that so that it reflected the National Planning Standards terminology. So the district plan already said that Paraparaumu was our metropolitan centre, which is for this district the top of the hierarchy, and it also had a policy which listed what were our town centres and what were our local centres. So that's how our district plan looked, and then government came along and they hopped onto that hierarchy and added to it a meaning that nobody knew it was going to add until it did it. And so all of a sudden a town centre zone triggered a particular degree of intensification, but by virtue of central government direction, and a local centre zone a slightly different degree, and a metropolitan centre zone a different degree again. So I guess where I'm coming from with this is that we didn't introduce town centre zoning or local centre zoning or metropolitan centre zoning through Plan Change 2. It was already in the district plan. That work had been done over the course of many years to be consistent with the regional policy statement, etc., etc. This is applying that hierarchy as the national direction requires us to do. In terms of your concern about things like, well, I guess qualifying matters, to be honest, Councillor, because there are a range of qualifying matters that are proposed to be included, existing ones and new ones, and Andrew's talked about those new ones, which are intended to manage where intensification isn't appropriate up to the government level that they've mandated. But again, getting back to the conversation we've had before, government's been very tight about what you can do with qualifying matters. So we've used that to the extent that we can, and things like the new coastal qualifying matter precinct is one example where our advice has been informed by a range of technical and legal advice that that's an area where we can prevent the government intensification occurring for now. And there's a range of other qualifying matters too, where there's flood hazards, for example. So we've tried to apply that tool where we can to manage where that intensification is just not appropriate.
And I guess as a follow-up to that would be, is there any leeway for us to change those designations at this stage or in the future, or has that been locked in by these previous designations as such?
In this plan change, no, but in future plan changes that don't have the same statutory constraints as this one, you can review these designations, but not with the constraints that we've got on this particular plan change.
Okay. And my second question is, and I'm sorry, this might be something I've just missed. 25.2.5 talks to building heights of up to 40 metres tall within a 400 walkable catchment of the town zone centre and 200 walkable distance from the local town centre zone. Is that from the middle? Like, have we got a point dot in the middle, or is it from the outer?
Yeah, it's from the edge.
It's from the edge.
Yeah.
So that really quite substantially increases those. Okay, cool, lovely, thank you.
Right, Councillor McCann.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Mayor. I do want to acknowledge, Jason, this is a hell of a grilling. It's a huge document, so I think you're doing an excellent job answering all these questions. We've obviously had some questions that we've put online. I have a couple more follow-ups. I'm sorry that I've got a couple of these follow-ups because I know that you did answer around the Waikanae North urban edge, but I think there's a matter of fairness here, so I just want to ask a couple more questions that might feed into the process later. When you talk about the Waikanae North urban edge, when was that line drawn?
It was added to the district plan, it looks like in about 2010.
So was that added after the property in question that it had built in that area?
It certainly appears to have happened after the subdivision had occurred.
Was there consultation with the people in that area that line was then drawn there?
Any plan change process would have had the consultation required of it by Schedule 1 of the Act with the public. I can't speak to specific notification of property owners, though.
Thank you. And with the fact that we've been looking at greenfield areas, etc., and I was initially told this was not appropriate, and then perhaps would have been appropriate to look at it at this point, and now I'm told again it's not appropriate. When is the right time to look at lines like the Waikanae North urban edge, given that we're trying to decide where we were growing into? What is the appropriate time for that work to be done?
Probably should clarify firstly, Councillor, that the property owner in question is well within their rights to make a submission on proposed plan change 2 and put forward the case why, in fact, in their view, it is appropriate. We have established a rationale for the approach of what is included as new greenfield areas through this plan change. There were a number of criteria established, and so the submitter will also be provided with some response to their feedback, which should inform the submission if they so chose to make it very shortly, which is in the material that councillors have in attachment 4. So the first thing to mention is it's not necessarily over yet when it comes to that issue. If that landowner wants to continue that conversation through the formal statutory process through plan change 2, they are fully entitled to do that. We do have a further urban development plan change in our forward work program in the long-term plan. I would anticipate that it will be a exercise for the next council to make some decisions about the scope of that plan change. One factor that the next council will no doubt consider is just how far does this intensification plan change progress us to meeting our housing needs. But look, that will be a decision for the next council to make as to what would they like to tackle in that next one.
Look, thank you. I'm not quite sure whether you answered my question about when is the appropriate time to look at that urban edge, that line. Were there any other equivalent lines in our region that we've effectively altered through Plan Change 2?
No.
Thank you. I've got another question, and it is about our trees in the protected area in Waikanai. I was just wondering that has the council talked to developers and asked whether the determination about requiring to put your minds to the protection of those trees, has that been canvassed with any of our developers as to whether it would have a chilling effect or a slowing effect on intensification?
We didn't specifically talk to individual developers about that, but I would note we received no submissions on the draft plan change about those policies at all.
Cool. Thank you very much. That's it from me.
Right. No other questions? Councillor Martin.
Yes, through you, Mr. Mayor. And look, sorry, I meant to ask this before. It is just a quick question, and my apologies if I should have seen this somewhere else. We've talked to the Marae Takiwai precinct in regards to Otaki. I'm just haven't really heard much about how that impacts the town centre in Waikanai, actually. And I was just curious, is that going to potentially limit, and there's no right or wrong to that, is this going to potentially limit the height in that township because of the proximity to the marae as such, considering that's one of the, obviously very close to a transport hub as such?
Yeah, so that is a good question, and the difference in Waikanai is that the marae is actually located within the town centre zone itself, as opposed to Rokawa, which is next to it. So what essentially the precinct is really, it's quite tightly held around the adjacent sites, and the majority of the precinct in Waikanai is the marae itself, plus the car park area to the south, and the row of shops directly to the north of the marae. The Section 32 report has an estimate of potential impacts on district-wide dwelling capacity as a result of these precincts, and it's negligible. It's a couple of hundred, I think it might be 400 dwellings for that one, as plan-enabled dwellings, not feasible or realisable ones, which would be expected to be smaller. So from our perspective, it's the price in terms of dwelling capacity is marginal compared to the broader benefits to tangata whenua in terms of the relationship between their marae and the way they use their marae. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Councillor Rendell.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Jason, I have some questions, but just very brief answers would be appreciated. So, first of all, what we pass today, is that going to restrict the rights of people to appeal? Are we passing anything today other than to go for consultation? That's the first question.
That is a pretty fair way to frame it, Councillor. What you are passing today would allow us to publicly notify the plan change, which would open it up for submissions. That is correct.
Okay. Okay. It gets briefer as we go on, Mr. Mayor. Kevin Burrows was one of the first speakers today, and if you could notify him that he has a right to appeal. You mentioned earlier you were going to notify the applications, the people who made objections, but if you could, his name is available, council staff will know who he is.
Yes.
Okay, so second question is, now this is a Janet and John bit, and you're going to be disappointed with me asking this, because it's about special character areas. I'm a very simple person, and I still cannot understand about the Waikanai Garden Precinct, and for that matter, the Waikanai Beach. We passed a resolution some time ago saying that we wanted to maintain the special character areas in Waitanai. Are you saying if we do pass P2, that resolution we passed will be invalidated?
Well, Councillor, what I can say is that in 2020 there was central government direction in the form of a national policy statement for urban development that under the law that council operates under, we must give effect to. There is a national direction that applies to all councils in respect of national policy statements. Then the RMA was amended late last year in such a way as to be very directive to council about what it must do to enable intensification. Neither of those national directions existed at the time that, and I believe it was variation 2 to the formally proposed district plan, was progressed. So the landscape within which council must work has changed since then.
Okay. So, I mean, the word must, I can remember very old case decisions by judges saying must can also mean should. So, I don't know if the word must is absolute. Okay, thanks for that. So the next question relates to off-street parking. I mean, can we eventually have in Paraparaumu streets just full of cars because there's no off-street parking? Being a requirement.
That is a challenging aspect of another central government direction which we must, and I mean must, comply with, which was to remove all minimum car parking requirements from the district plan. And we had to do that. No Schedule 1 process, no consultation. We had to do that, and we did that in February this year because we had a deadline to meet then too. Yes, that is a potential consequence, Councillor. It's a consequence that we raised, I believe, way back when we put a submission in as a council on the National Policy Statement for Urban Development when it was being progressed in 2020. And it's a challenge for many councils around the country.
Okay, the last thing is the Kirsten, I think her name is. But anyway, the iwi who spoke about slowing things down a bit. I remember Pat Dignan, one of the first speakers on this a few months ago, talking about slowing things down a bit. But your argument is the government is requiring this, and we must, we must comply with what the central government is saying. That's a question.
Okay, I would say yes to that statement / question, Councillor. That is essentially what we are saying. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Right. No other questions. Recommendations A to D is been moved by Councillor Compton, and I see the Councillor McCann wants to be the seconder for that. Right of intro.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think this is a pretty momentous day for Kapiti. As I think every council that's gone through this process, it's been very momentous. And I think, first of all, it would be remiss of me not to thank staff for what has been incredible work on this since the NPS on urban development was last updated, but more importantly, since Parliament decided, without giving anyone any heads up, late last year, that they were going to introduce the medium density residential standards, which I imagine probably more than doubled your workload. But I also, in particular, want to single out Jason and thank him for his timely responses to questions this week, which for me anyway, have gone a long way to address the concerns that I've had about the way that local character policies would interact with the MDRS. I think there's one of my areas of concern and how that might constrain development going forward. And I think the way you've answered those questions, and obviously acknowledging there is ambiguity going forward that won't be resolved until this gets tested, I think the way you've answered those has been really reassuring and really professional. So thank you very much for that, and actually for the way you've handled the very robust questioning today. I think it's really important as we think about Plan Change 2 and we think about the views that we've heard while I've been developing that came through submissions. I was surprised we only had the one speaker on it today, all things considered, but I think that's actually testament to the work that was done in terms of consulting on the draft proposed plan change. I think it's worth reflecting on how we actually got to the position where Parliament and the government decided they had to do this. Now, the Infrastructure Commission actually spelled this out very helpfully back in April. They put out a report on this very topic of how we built our way into this housing crisis, though technically it's how we didn't build our way into it, because they said that council plans facilitated infill housing prior to the 1970s, but started to limit it after that point. Planning began to focus less on facilitating growth and planning infrastructure and more on maintaining the character of existing neighbourhoods by stopping the construction of blocks of flats and apartments. Now, there's obviously a lot more detail behind that, and there's obviously the Resource Management Act, when that was introduced in 1990, that sort of supercharged the ability of people and limited the ability of councils to facilitate growth. But what we've seen over the last 2 decades in particular, I think, is an explosion in house prices that is forcing people out of our communities. And I'd refer people back to the really excellent housing needs assessment that this council put together that showed that I think it was 88% of renters couldn't afford the median rent in Kapiti, and 95% of them couldn't actually afford to service a mortgage to purchase the house at the lower quartile, so that's the 25th percentile. So that's roughly an affordable house. That's a shocking statistic that I think it's an indictment on the country as a whole, because I don't think Kapiti has particularly caused this to happen, but it's the country as a whole and various systems that are in place have caused that to happen. And I think there's a news story that went up on Stuff today that really illustrates sort of how this has really manifested itself over the last sort of 30 years of the RMA. And that's with there was a resource consent that was granted in Glendowie in Auckland to build 17 townhouses on a few lots that were going to be demolished and cleared to build them. And the resource consent was initially granted on a non-notified basis, all good to go. But then the neighbours got involved and decided that they would judicially review that decision, which they're entitled to do under the RMA and those sorts of things. So then it went back out. The developer was like, well, we're not going to fight the judicial review. We'll just we'll allow it to be notified and we'll go from there. There were more than 200 submissions from all the neighbours on the street. And you should read the Stuff article because some of them are quite amusing. Someone was complaining that it didn't the development didn't keep in character with the aptly named Beverly Hills subdivision, which gives you an idea of the character that the people there were hoping to preserve. But one of the most absurd ones I saw was someone was complaining that they felt that street should just be for elderly people and that the townhouses might attract young couples there. This was a street that is 13 kilometres from the Auckland CBD, and they don't think young couples should be able to live in that street. My God, I don't know what puts people in the mindset where they don't think young families deserve a home near to a large urban city like Auckland. That sort of thing just made me embarrassed to be reading it, and I don't even live in Auckland. But I think that's just one extreme example of what's happened over the last 30 years. But we sort of see this play out time and time again, and it's essentially nixed the construction of what I would, guesstimate would be hundreds of thousands of houses. And we've got this massive shortfall in this country. It's basic economics, supply and demand. We have not been able to supply enough houses for the demand we've got, therefore prices have gone up. Property speculation has become a thing which has added fuel on that fire. And I think the lower quartile house price in Kapiti has increased by 435% over the last 20 years, and that was compared to median household incomes only increasing by 112% over those 20 years. So if you feel like your head is slowly dipping below water and drowning in terms of housing costs, you're absolutely right. I think about my kids. I've got 2 young boys. I want them to be able to afford a house here in Kapiti. I want their kids to be able to afford a house here in Kapiti. And for me, that's what this is about. We have to have some pretty huge change in the way that we facilitate our district planning processes. We have to change. There's a whole lot of other things that need to change in terms of the way we finance people getting into houses and that sort of thing. But this plan change is one thing that we can actually control to supercharge the ability to build houses here. Because I know, look, I'm completely cognizant of the fact that a lot of people don't want growth and they want to preserve things in amber as they are now. You know, some of them, I bet you, they would love to build a wall up in Transmission Gully and emulate Donald Trump, or put up a big sign saying, sorry, we were full. But the reality is the reason why we choose to live here and the reasons why other people choose to live here, they're going to still exist. People want to move to Kapiti. It's an attractive place to be. So as a community, we need to embrace that challenge and realise the opportunities it can bring, because communities that don't do that, they're the communities that fail their people. They force the people who have grown up there to have to move out and live somewhere else. And that's, you know, go to our Facebook pages in our local community, go on Neighbourly, you'll see heartbreaking stories of people having to move away from their whānau, from their family, from all their support networks, from employment opportunities, because they cannot afford to live here in Kapiti. We are meant to be an inclusive community for all people, regardless of your socio or economic status. And that's what I hope that things like this plan change will do. That's why I realise, as the Mayor's put it, that it was a sledgehammer to crack a walnut, but that's a situation that we've not built ourselves into, because we didn't build the houses over the last 30 or 40 years, so the sledgehammer had to come out. I'm enthusiastically supportive of this, and I'm looking forward to how Kapiti will change over the next 30 years as we realise the opportunities from this, because I'm really excited about what the future can hold for Kapiti under this.
Councillor Holiday.
Through you, Mr. Chair. First of all, Jason, you've thanked everybody else, and I think Councillor Compton was very succinct in saying thank you. Thank you for all the work that you've done in this space. I've mentioned it before, but you're just like the calming influence and very informative person. That and I don't know what it's like with all the other interfaces, but I find the interactions with you and your team in this space to be fantastic. To be very, very informing, very clear, and it is really, really appreciated. But that leading comes from the top, and I just want to make very clear that you are acknowledged in that space. I agree with everything that Councillor Compton said, but I do put a caveat on that, is that I do think we need some character areas. 13%, I think, was the statistic I saw, are the areas that our communities have gone, look, we want to keep these like the old style of New Zealand, and I think there needs to be a balance. I agree that we need to intensify, and I think we've located those areas being around those hubs as good places for that. But I am concerned that we could potentially lose those character spots, which very much make up a part of what makes Kapiti the place that it is. And I do appreciate that some of those areas might fall into the hands, or more than likely are falling into the hands, of people with the elusive dollar. But they're all part of our community as well, as long as we've got the broad range. And I see a broad range of options being opened up here. I do have concern around the size of the buildings that are being proposed down in our waterfronts. I think that's part of what makes Kapiti a bit special is the view we have out to sea, and I'm concerned that there's going to be a wall of buildings that will block that view. And again, that intensification being where I think that intensification should be, which is around our hubs and our transport nodes. But fantastic piece of work. Again, our districts, I think, front-footing a lot of things here. Again, down to the hard work of council officers in that space. But I'll certainly be supporting this moving forward, and look very much to see how the submission process goes. Thank you.
Councillor Hempert.
Yeah, kia ora. I'll try and keep this pretty quick, but again, echoing the thanks from all the other councillors who have spoken to both of yourselves and the wider team. And Jason, I think it's amazing that yesterday you were at the Kapiti Youth Careers Expo, and then also in the afternoon sending off these big long emails about and answering Councillor Compton. Team effort. But yeah, appreciating how much work you have to juggle and how present you still are to all of our concerns or questions, but also those of the wider community. So yeah, very, very awesome. And would also like to mihi to our iwi partners for their involvement in this and in creating the time and space to really feed in, as Kirsten has mentioned, like some pretty transformational thinking and some real leadership. So I'm really excited to see kind of where that leadership continues to take us, and how we can continue to be, or our iwi partners can continue to be examples of that and what that can mean for our communities. And would like to acknowledge too the opportunities that we've had to kind of workshop things and to have conversations to get to this point. I don't in any way see this being, obviously there's been a lot to get our heads around, but we have had the opportunity through the process of shaping up what comes to us today to then put out to the public to actually make our views known. So that's been really, a really good opportunity to have. And kind of building slightly off of what Councillor Compton said, if we think about the outcomes, obviously housing and the provision of a broader typology of housing for a broader range of people is extremely important, and the opportunities that intensification through this plan change will give us to address our climate challenges is also something worth noting. And I thank the team for being open to, as Kirsten said, actualising Te Tipu Pai in the way that we grow, not just for the sake of growth, but actually growing in a way that centres people in the planet and looks to capitalise on those opportunities. So it's a real tool, I think, in our kind of array of different climate action to incentivise active modes of transport and get people out of their private vehicles and get people more socially and environmentally connected. So looking forward to embracing the challenges and opportunities that will come, no doubt, with the process of this, hearing from the public, but also kind of further into the future as well. So thanks again for all your mahi.
Councillor Coates.
Thank you, Worship. Look, I think amongst the table there are varying views on varying degrees, but I have no doubt that everyone acknowledges that something needs to change, and that change needs to lead to more affordable and accessible housing for our community. So, I don't see that we're too far apart around that particular issue in itself, and some of the points that Councillor Compton's raised and Councillor McCann has also raised and others across the triennium. Change is needed. But look, I just read out a paragraph from the Auckland decision where the Planning Committee Chairperson Chris Darby said their proposal was a balanced approach to delivering the government's strong direction to enable more housing while ensuring areas with special character value could be protected. Now, I'm not necessarily saying I agree with Auckland's position around special character, and I have looked at some of the points that they're making there. The point that I'm making is that they've pushed back on behalf of their community in terms of the sledgehammer that the government's using to crack the walnut. And that was simply the point that I was trying to make earlier with some of the pleas from not just Ngā Hapu, but specifically Ngā Hapu or Otaki around the intensification around particularly Marae and that town centre. The reality is, if Otaki was part of Horowhenua, it wouldn't have been included in this proposal, and the government still would have required Kapiti to reach those goals, and they would have. It's just the sheer fact that Otaki sits on the boundary, as Kirsten has mentioned, as part of Kapiti. So look, I'll just keep it brief. I think what we're looking for here is a balanced approach that meets the needs, and for some we feel that probably just goes a step too far and too soon. So my plea to council staff is the earlier comment from Kirsten that council fulfills its earlier promise around supporting iwi in their approaches directly to government around the concerns that they've got. We made that commitment a few months ago. I'm not too sure whether that's been followed up on, but I certainly hope that we can support them in raising what are some quite serious issues there for a smaller community. Thank you very much, Jason, for, I think, what was it, the voice of reason or something? I appreciate your guidance.
The voice of did one.
Yeah, thank you.
Councillor McCann.
Kia ora, through you, Mr. Mayor. I think it's been a really, really good debate and love hearing everything from our councillors. But I would say that one of the things that councils need to do is be an enabler. And history shows that actually, once we got to the 1970s that Councillor Compton so eloquently waxed on about, is that councils actually became a blockage to development, a blockage to people being able to afford new homes. And I only need to look at the stats that our own council has printed. Over 88% of renters are unable to affordably purchase a dwelling at the lower quartile house price. House prices increased nearly 4 times faster than household incomes between 2021 and 2001 and 2021. And pretty much the same thing with rents, increasing 40% more than household incomes. So when we have people saying that perhaps we shouldn't go as fast as we're going, I do need to remind people that we have people still living in garages. We have families that will never be able to get onto the housing ladder because councils and governments have made rules and regulations which have prioritised the rights of current homeowners ahead of everyone else. So while I do acknowledge that, the government came in with a bit of a sledgehammer, we were heading in the right direction with our Growing Well strategy. And yes, we haven't been able to follow through on some of the more strategic decisions. But bluntly, this was something that had to happen because our country has priced people out of having decent homes, of being able to live with their whānau, with their family, live in the communities that they want to. And I do recognise that there is always that concern that we're going to be overrun by people coming to live here. But if I look around the room, on the KCDC council meeting room, and I look on my screen, how many of us actually moved here? And I hear it so often when people say, I moved here because it's a great place to live, but I don't want it to change. You can't have that oxymoronic kind of thinking. We have to actually go, how can we make this a great place to live and remain a great place to live? And I think this council has done an excellent job, led by Jason and everyone who's been involved in trying to make sure that the planning around this growth that we know is coming and the lack of houses that are already in our region is identified by the housing needs assessment. We've got to have change. So there'll always be elements that we're unhappy with around the edges, but this document is a really good step in the right direction for making sure that everyone can have a home and can call this place home. So congratulations, team, on the terrific work you've done, and obviously now's the chance, if we do pass this, and I hope we do, for the community to be able to have a say and discuss the things around the edges. So, thank you.
Councillor Pravanov.
So firstly, thank you to Jason and the team for the input into this, and I suppose also everyone else in the community has also inputted into this. I suppose, to me, there's two parts to this. One is about solving a problem of housing shortages for people who really need them, who cannot afford them at present. The other one is how you actually go about doing that. And I suppose what I'm getting to here is that, there's no question that we need more houses, but I suppose really the devil is in the detail. And I suppose one of my concerns is, some of the wording around the plan change that potentially is going to degrade our environment at the detriment of more houses. And I suppose, like, when you look in the document, there's many words like consideration will be given. That doesn't provide any guarantees, and I suppose that is really my concern. And once those types of words are not actually providing any assurity that our environment that we all really do value is actually going to stay as it is. So I haven't quite decided whether I'm actually going to vote for this yet, to go out to public consultation, because I do have really some concerns about whether or not it actually, the wording actually does protect what, there's two parts of this, is our environment and actually having more houses. And I suppose in reality, the devil is in the detail. So, there's lots and lots of points that I could raise during, that have been written in the document, but I'm not going to. But I think really it's a case of where I think there is still some room for improvement, and hopefully that will come out in this next consultation round. Okay, thank you. Bye.
Right. Anybody else? Let me just say this. Listening to all of us here, I hear repeatedly the need for balance. And we go back to the original growth document, Growing Well, which has been mentioned a couple of times. And I go back to core Manawhainga values in terms of a growth that is able, that can be able through a sustainable environment. There's a question mark they've raised around that. And I think that's a key part of it. And nobody is saying that, you know, the right of current owners should be supreme. Current household owners should be supreme. But I think the right of an environment that is sustainable should be supreme. Because it is the lack of understanding that has created not only the situation here in this country, but globally, and the climate change factor. So we need a balance between solving the housing crisis and at the same time not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, where you compromise the environmental outcomes you need for growing well, or being well, because that's also a mental health situation. In this one, you know that the government is moving very fast, a bipartisan approach they've taken, the MDRS, but we know at the same time the Ministry of Environment is struggling with a whole range of environmental issues. Their national policy statement, Indigenous biodiversity, in discussing that, they've alerted the increasing potential of tension between intensification and the conservation and enhancement of the environment. But the fact is, the timing of these two policies, the housing intensification one is leading it, and I know that council has a creature of statute, and council staff who are the cold face of trying to manage this are struggling with this same tension. They are required to move with the current legislation on intensification, while at the same time being aware there's legislation coming that will try and balance the impact on the environment. We live in interesting times. So I again tautaku the work that you put into this under tremendous pressure. I understand what Councillor Coates is saying in terms of the huge volume of documentations that we need to have gone through. But we've been here before when the government has legislated with very tight timelines, and we know we have even forced to do submissions in retrospect. It's, you know, we put our hands up and this is what happens, and under this particular government things are moving fast and we need to be nimble, and we can't read everything that's necessary, but in faith I read the executive summaries of council reports, and I'm satisfied that the job has been done to guide us in the direction that we need to go. With that, I now ask Councillor Compton, his right of reply.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think Councillor Coates brings up one of the core issues that's being debated around the country at the moment, and that's the character of areas. And I think his reference of what's going on in Auckland is going to be one of those test cases for it, because there has been a lot of discussion about the legality of their approach. But I think it's interesting to think about, given that that's being sort of cited as, look, there's an opportunity to push back against what the government is doing. I think it's really interesting, and the most recent issue of Metro Mag, Hayden Donnell had a really good article about the debate in Auckland over special character areas, and Scott Cordell from the Coalition of for More Homes, which is being really active up in Auckland, he made the point that those special character areas may have only covered 4% of Auckland, but they are actually 100% of the areas in Auckland where people want to live, because if you look at a map of them, they're in a ring around the CBD of Auckland. And I think it's really useful when you're thinking about special character areas and the identity that they are, whose character are they trying to preserve. Carolyn Hill, who's a teaching fellow of environmental planning at the University of Waikato, wrote a really interesting article about this recently, and I'll just pick some quotes out. She says, "It's no coincidence special character suburbs are some of Tamaki Makaurau's most expensive, commanding a price premium precisely because of the expectation their historical look and feel will be retained." She goes on, "While historical residential neighbourhoods may be part of the city's broad identity, It is the residents of special character areas who really get to experience their qualities. The good tree cover, proximity to the central business district, high quality outdoor spaces and access to public transport are in stark contrast to other parts of Tamaki Makaurau. I mean, so that sounds great if you live in those areas, doesn't it? But she does make a really valid point about the trade-off you make if you're going to preserve special character areas and that sort of thing, and where you're going to direct that development to. She makes the point that, and yet, most of the densification burden will be directed into communities already lacking nature, amenity and infrastructure. And that's ultimately what happens when special character gets preserved, is that densification gets put onto communities, predominantly poorer communities who have less ability to engage with the political processes and the legal processes of local government. They're the ones who get that burden and end up with even worse outcomes, while the existing privilege of, let's be honest, largely Pākehā, upper class communities gets preserved. And, you know, that's something that I don't think Kapiti stands for. I think that's something that Aotearoa shouldn't stand for. And that's why I think this sort of, sledgehammer approach from the government to hopefully finally crack the nut of housing affordability is so important.
Right. Recommendations A to D moved by Councillor Compton, seconded by Councillor McCann. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those online, can you? Councillor Rendell.
We have Councillor Coates, we have Councillor Holborough and Councillor McCann in favour. We have Councillor Pavanov against, and we have Councillor Randall abstaining.
Okay, it's carried. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Your Worship, sorry, Councillor Pravanov has called for a division.
Okay, everybody. Can I ask you, all those in favour, James up?
So no, we need to call the names.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
Whichever.
Okay, got to go. All right, Mr. Mayor.
In
That's
favour?
acceptable.
Yep.
Councillor Hanford, Councillor Buswell, Councillor Compton, Councillor Halliday, and online we have Councillor Holborough, Councillor Coates, and Councillor McCann in support.
Those against?
We have Councillor Pavanov.
And abstention,
Councillor Randall.
Okay, it's carried. Thank you very much. You did really well.
Wait, Janet, do it again. Put your...
That doesn't mean you can renegotiate your wages.
Thank
you. Your beard is just grown in the last few seconds. Right. Item 10.4, reports and recommendations of standing committees and committee boards. No, we finish this one, then begin. Yeah, so we can, that's right. So we just finish this one. So this is the Pakakarikin Community Board and the Parapumu Community Board.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. We're simply asking that the Council receives this report. Standing committees and community boards in the time frame that the report covers did not make any recommendations to Council. Happy to take any questions.
No questions. So I move that the Council receives this report. All those in favor say aye. Or can I have a seconder? Yeah. Councillor Hanford. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. The next one is item 11, confirmation of minutes of 3 council meetings. Any issues on those? No. So I move that or can somebody move that the minutes of the 23rd June and the 30th June and the 7th July meetings be accepted as a true and correct record? Moved by Councillor Buswell, seconded by Councillor Hanford. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against, carried. We can now. Should we just take a break down and then I'll come back and go into public exclusion? We'll take a break for lunch.
Your Worship, there's also the public speaking.
Oh, there's one letter. Right, so you all got a copy of the letter. But we will say that the letter, you all have received the letter, that we take it as read. And can I move that that matter be referred to staff to respond?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, as well. I went actually had a look at the property yesterday, had a chat with the person who sent the letter. She's off overseas for a couple of weeks. I think she's got quite a valid concern there, so I'd be very interested in talking to staff around that as well, in the conversation I had with her too. But there's just runoff with regards to the development that's happening next door, and I think it really does need to be looked into and considered.
Right, thank you for that. So we just ask staff to come back with a response to that. Would their response be written to the councillors?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We can do a written response back to the council. I want to give you the reassurance that staff have been working really closely with the writer of the letter. We understand her concerns, and as Councillor Halliday has suggested, we have some sympathy for her position. Staff are working closely with her and the builders. She did have a relationship with the builder who is keen to remedy the situation once we have a better understanding. Unfortunately, that relationship between the two parties has broken down, so staff have had to get involved. But I can reassure you we're doing what we can to remedy that. I refer you to the earlier comments from Rita about groundwater coming up, and that area, as you well know, is pretty low lying. And we have a development just north of there, a much bigger development that we're working very closely with that developer on making sure the same thing doesn't happen again. So if I can give you that reassurance, but we can give you a written response. We've been in contact with her regularly, but and we'll attach previous correspondence.
Thank you very much. With that, I think we will take a break. 2:30 is fine. 2:30 we're back, and then we'll go into public exclusion at that time. Thank you very much. What's for lunch?